Okay, good. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to share the wild side of Florida that sometimes is hiding in plain sight for the people who live there. And I've been really privileged to be turning my lens towards the home landscape for nearly 10 years ago now. But my work into conservation photography began further from home, seeing Peter's images and whatnot reminded me of how I got started, which was really teaming up with Smithsonian scientists to try to tell the stories of species and learning about biological diversity and the power of imagery to bring higher profile to science stories. So I got to work in Gabon and had these awesome experiences coming out of graduate school and during graduate school to be able to learn about camera traps and see elephants and do work that was always teaming up with science to try to share a message. I got to work with some desert elephants in Mali and do some more camera trap work and gain a great appreciation for the way the animals needed to move across wide spaces. In this case, they migrate 500 miles each year through 2 different countries. Also, a strong affinity for the cultural connections to ecological stories. But every time I was getting on an airplane and leaving Florida for 1 month or 3 months, I would come home and pieces of my home state that looked like this were looking like this. And we were losing 150,000 acres of agricultural land a year to development, going on and on for decades. So one of the untold stories in Florida is the ranch country. People know of our beaches, they know of our theme parks. People in this room know about the Everglades and other aspects, but we have nearly 6 million acres of cattle ranch that are oftentimes some of the best wildlife habitat in the state, and in this image, protecting the headwaters of the Everglades. So I can give you all the ecological reasons why I focused on ranching, but I also have a heritage in this world. I grew up with 1 foot in the suburbs and 1 foot in ranch country. This is me and my grandfather on horseback back when I was a boy, and this is my great-grandfather, Doyle Carlton, in the summer of 1929. I'm an 8th generation Floridian, and he was a rancher who went on to become Florida's 25th governor in 1929. And his son, the man in this picture, is someone I reacquainted with when he was 80 years old and I was a graduate student. And I learned from him how he would ride a horse for 2 or 3 days at a time without seeing a fence as a boy. And to gain a sense of the land and the stewardship through his eyes, it set me on a journey to photograph Florida's ranch country. And I've done that for nearly 12 years now, and I published a book on it in 2009 and started to get a view of looking from our state from the inside out rather than from the outside in, which is the case with our coastlines. In 2007, when I was working on my 2nd annual Florida Ranches calendar, I learned about a new Florida ranch character, and that's the Florida black bear. And there's a bear population in south central Florida that lives almost entirely on private cattle ranches. And my now very good friend Joe Guthrie was putting a GPS collar on these bears and learning about how they moved through the Florida landscape. I'm going to see which one of these laser. Top one. Okay, cool. So this is Interstate 4 in the upper left and Lake Okeechobee down in the lower right. One bear he collared in 2009 went on a 500-mile journey. In 2 months, it covered 500 miles and 105 miles from north to south, and very notably skirted the edge of Interstate 4 between Tampa and Orlando and presumably had no way to get across before turning around and returning back to its home range and dropping its GPS collar. But this bear told us what scientists suspected, in that we have large interconnected landscapes through the patchwork of public lands and working agricultural lands. But that cannot be taken for granted. This is a recent picture of the type of sprawl that's spreading out from places like Orlando and really squeezing what remains of wildlife corridors in our state. You can see there's a lot of creativity in these houses. If you look closely, you can pick between a round pool and one with square edges. So one of the big motivating factors for me, in addition to spending that time with my Uncle Doyle, was to see this study that came out in 2006. The red is the developed footprint of Florida, representing a population of 16 million people, which was our population then. This is a projection for the year 2060 to accommodate a doubling of population to 30 million people, which some people thought was far-fetched, but keep in mind that in 9 years since 2006, with the Great Recession, we've added 4 million people to become the third most populous state in the country, behind California and Texas. So you can see what this does to vast natural areas like Ocala National Forest, Everglades National Park. Things could be truly isolated and forever cut off from one another. But it doesn't have to be that way. And so through this photography of the black bears and learning about the research that was going on, I became aware of the vision for wildlife corridors and green infrastructure in Florida. But this is something that has not been historically in public conversation. So there is a vision and a way to keep this infrastructure intact, and I propose that we call this Florida Wildlife Corridor. This is back in 2009, and try to develop an outreach campaign around the possibility that we still have to maintain these places. And this just shows some of the conservation priorities and those linkages. So we started out on Earth Day of 2010 with a painting that showed the vision, and then inspired by Mike Fay and others who I haven't had a chance to meet, we decided to go on that 1,000-mile expedition in 2012 to show that this corridor is still possible and connected. Joined with team members, Mallory Likes-Dimmitt, who's the executive director of our small nonprofit in Florida, and that bear biologist, Joe Guthrie. And we set out to traverse the length of Florida and to show that we still have the corridor. I'm just going to fly through a couple pictures from the first expedition through the open sawgrass of the Everglades, moving our way up closer to the Everglades Headwaters, places like the Fakahatchee Strand and home to the ghost orchid, places where swallowtail kites aggregate on private ranch lands by the thousands before they make their annual migration down to Brazil, where bobcats still move through the scrub. Beautiful places like this, the Kissimmee Prairie, where it's home to the grasshopper sparrow, the most endangered bird in North America, and part of a vision for large landscape conservation. So by the time we were getting close to the end of the 2012 journey, entering the Okefenokee Swamp, we knew we were only telling part of the story. So we put the plan in place for the Glades to Gulf expedition, which happened this year. We set off in the Everglades Headwaters near Orlando and headed north and west through the patchwork of public and agricultural lands towards Pensacola. So I'm going to take you through some of these places and just share a few stories. I can't share the whole experience in these few minutes, but notably, the Everglades Headwaters is an area that is kind of right up against the sprawl of Orlando, but it's also a great hope for conservation. There's a 150,000-acre National Wildlife Refuge and Conservation Area that's been approved. Only 10 acres have been protected. But it would combine private protected lands like the Nature Conservancy's Disney Wilderness Preserve here with adjacent working cattle ranches and collectively protect a large landscape. It's one of the first applications of conservation easements through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the eastern United States. But the tension between this scene and this scene, they're right on each other's doorstep. And this is that image I showed earlier. But during the first week of the expedition, we crossed the only place on Interstate 4 between Tampa and Orlando where there's still green space on both sides of the road. And so this is an area that is largely in protection, but has no functional wildlife crossings. There's a little tunnel that we used that was built just to help the rancher move his farm equipment back and forth back when the interstate was put in. This would be a great place to be retrofitted with a wildlife corridor in the future. So we trekked from there through the Green Swamp, and the theme for my work, instead of going, I started off going as far away from home as possible to find stories that hadn't been told. And I'm finding now there's so many untold, overlooked, and forgotten places within 60 miles of my home. And this is the Green Swamp, which is the source of water for 3 million people in the Tampa metropolitan area that very few people even know exists. So moving along out of the green swamp, we came along to the nature coast, and this is where I'm going to share some images of our freshwater springs. The Chassahowitzka River, home to the manatees, and areas that really rely on the interconnection and protection of lands and waters. This cormorant, I don't know how it let me swim this close with a 14mm wide-angle lens and 2 flashes, but it somehow cooperated and let me take this picture in the Rainbow River near Dunnellon, where people like Jenny Adler, who's also a Florida photographer here, knows this scene where you get the mixing of tannic waters and the blue spring waters flowing out. But the springs are in trouble, and this picture shows that. You might not know it without a caption, but this filamentous algae has overrun many of the springs. I would dare to say most of the springs throughout Florida. It's fed by phosphorus and nitrogen from fertilizers and runoff and reduced flows, and it's replaced the eelgrass and a lot of the native wildlife and biodiversity. So moving around the Gulf Coast, we have beautiful places along the nature coast like the Swanee River, where those freshwater flows are directly tied to the livelihoods of people doing fishing and aquaculture, in this case raising farm-raised oysters in the shallow mudflats. The next phase of the journey took us around the Big Bend, coming in south of Tallahassee, where you have magical rivers that actually disappear into the limestone aquifer. This is the Oscilloscope, and you can walk along, and that's the river going down like a bathtub drain. And you hike 15 minutes down the trail, and there it is popping up again, flowing further towards the coastline, into vast, beautiful, marshy coastlines like this as it enters the Gulf of Mexico. Another theme in this area is the importance of the forest. And like we had the working cattle ranch in South Florida, the working pine forest in North Florida provide the fabric that connects the corridor between the existing public lands. So we entered the big waters of the Apalachicola River. And this flows from the Chattahoochee River and the Flint Rivers in Georgia, where Atlanta really puts a strain and a big drinking straw into that water supply. But then it moves its way down through the cypress swamps and all the way to the coast in Apalachicola, where 80% of the people derive their livelihoods from marine fisheries. And I have a lot of Florida heroes, Florida cowboys and Florida fishermen among them. This man, Kendall Shellis, is a third-generation oysterman who tongs for wild-caught oysters in Apalachicola Bay, and to me is an icon of these fragile ecosystems and how they rely on the interconnections far, far from those shores. Moving further west, we've left the million acres of associated protected lands near Apalachicola National Forest and entered an area of largely private timberlands with a future that is somewhat in question, but there's some great areas of hope. This is a man named MC Davis in the red shirt with E.O. Wilson, where Mr. Davis was a developer years ago who got inspired by the story of the Florida black bear and has created the Ngozi Plantation, a 50,000-acre private conservation land, and the E.O. Wilson Biophilia Center, which brings youth from around the region to learn about these fragile landscapes and biological diversity. It's also the site of the largest private longleaf pine restoration in the world. They have 50,000 acres of former farmland that has been replanted into this forest type that 200 years from now could resume its former majesty. They've also pioneered in wildlife crossings. When the Department of Transportation came to MC Davis and said, we want to widen the road coming through your property, he said, you can do it if you put in 3 wildlife underpasses. So they found historic drainages, and combined with high cross fencing, these will be revegetated. And we hiked through one of these wildlife underpasses to get to what lies on the other side of the road, which is the 450,000-acre Eglin Air Force Base. This is a place that has the oldest pine trees left in Florida. They're 500-year-old longleaf pines. It's also a centerpiece to the largest connected longleaf pine forest left in the world. You have 1 million acres of land, 600,000 or more of which is in longleaf pine, that stretches from that private land that MC Davis restored through Blackwater River State Forest up into Connecticut National Forest in southern Alabama, home to the red-cockaded woodpecker and other iconic species of these landscapes. The longleaf pine forest is one of the most biodiverse forest types in the planet. You have 40 different species associated with a single square meter in the ground cover at some places. Coming to kind of a concluding story, for me, the icon that brought me into the wildlife corridor is the Florida black bear, and it's also galvanized my passion to try to protect and connect these places. Recently, we had a decision where they had the first bear hunt in Florida since 1994, and it has caught a lot of public attention. There were 300 bears killed in a single day last Saturday. This man was a bear hunter from Pennsylvania who used to hunt bears with his father and now does it in Florida, but it's really, they got out ahead of the science, and they started the hunt before they had all the full population data in place. My hope is that those bears did not all die in vain, because there are a lot of people who didn't know we had bears in Florida and are starting to ask questions, and a lot of the environmental community is paying attention. It moved me to write an essay that was in the Tampa Bay Times about this, and it looks at 7 semi-isolated bear populations that exist from one end of the state to the next, from the Everglades all the way over to Eglin Air Force Base. And you can see the overlay between the Florida Wildlife Corridor and the bear habitat. And if we can come back and use this bear as an icon, and we can use the science to drive conservation, reconnecting the bear populations is in essence protecting and connecting the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So hopefully there'll be a long and bright future for these guys, and I hope to now go back. I've had the privilege now to walk and trek 2,000 miles to the length and width of the state, and my intention now is to go back and dig deeper into those stories and to keep publishing and keep coming back, and have a new book on it that's about 4 pounds, and it'll be a persuasive instrument on enforcing legislators in Tallahassee to pay attention and protect these corridors. There's a policy side to this, and I really see a lot of my role in the next few years is telling that story, because we have $700 million a year that has been voter approved for land conservation in Florida that our legislature has failed to spend on land conservation. So there are lawsuits with Defenders of Wildlife and Florida Wildlife Federation and others trying to change that, but we actually have a mechanism that could actually fill in the gaps and make this thing real in the next 20 years if we can hold their feet to the fire and get it done. So I'll conclude with a 90-second trailer, which is for a film that's going to air on Florida PBS this Saturday and should be available nationally early next year.
Like so much of Florida, in order to see it, you've got to get down in the mud and get back into the trees and up into the rivers and into the backwaters and dig around.
Stay still. She's winding us right now.
We came up with the idea to do an expedition.
We're going to go out and we're going to explore wild Florida, and we're going to do it the way a bear or a panther could still travel through our state.
We'll be paddling, biking, or hiking for 1,000 miles in 70 days.
The expeditioner cannot be late.
There are these enormous challenges to overcome for an animal moving through the woods.
Is there another spot? Where's the bridge?
That drops off right there.
There's the fear of the unknown.
Oh, he's gonna crush your camera, dude.
Literally the forgotten coast of Florida.
I don't think very many people know this place exists. These are the wildest and best places we have left. This is amazing, following these 2 manatees right out of the spring.
The wild heart of Florida that so many people don't even know about.
For me, it's a reminder of why we're undertaking this huge mission. It's to protect places like this.
This is Florida. Thank you.